Hello, I'm Dr. Erica Holley, and today we're going to talk about justice and trust in the workplace and when they're broken or violated, how that impacts our team's performance. So the first topic we're going to tackle is trust. And trust is one of those topics that people understand it's important, but they don't really know how to break down the pieces of it and how to repair it when it's broken. And so I'm going to talk about the different things that dictate how much we trust others. And there are several factors. So one of them being actually something that we call dispositional trust. And dispositional trust is essentially your baseline trust level. So it's your personality, things that have happened to you in the past, your culture, all these things coming together and dictating how much you trust other people. So interestingly enough, your trust propensity can be measured, and I'm going to include with this presentation a survey that you can take and figure out how trusting you are, something that you could give your teammates as well to figure out how trusting they are. My parents were always very much everything around the corner could kill you or maim you. My father had Lyme disease, and so he would always say when he would see a bunny, he would say, "That's a treacherous bunny. Watch out for those, Erica." So, you imagine most kids, grow up with someone seeing a bunny and saying, "Oh, how cute." And so for my family, it was the treacherous bunny, right? So fear around every corner. So for me, my trust propensity is actually quite low. And I think a lot of that was sort of being raised in that type of environment. I love my parents. It's just, they were like, must survive at all costs in every scenario, worst case scenario. But another thing that impacts this is your culture. So if you're from a culture that's relatively trusting, like Sweden, for example, very trusting culture, or you're in a culture that actually has a very low trust propensity, like Brazil, you're going to come and start at a different base. Same thing if you were stepping in to manage a company or manage a team. I'm just focusing on the team right now. If you were to come in and manage a team and you walk into a mess, and the fact is that they've had very, very poor relationships with their supervisors and with each other, trust is broken down. So your base level trust that you're going to be starting with is pretty low based on their experience, okay? The second kind of trust that we talk about is something called cognitive trust. And this is kind of your rational assessment of if you think you can trust somebody. This is based on a couple of different things. So, and we usually measure this as something called leader trustworthiness. And it's a factor of your competence as a leader. So if you've ever had an incompetent boss who has really no idea what they're doing and somehow they got promoted to this position, which happens a lot, you find that actually low levels of competence are going to break trust, right? Because people see that and they think, I don't trust this guy. He has no idea what the heck is going on. Okay, so competence is part of that cognitive base, that rationalizing, rationalized kind of trust that we have. Another part of that is kind of your assessment of your leader's integrity, okay, or character. So do we think that they hold themselves to a certain level of moral values, codes, ethics, things like that, okay? Or do we think that they're pretty loose with that and they're kind of okay with walking all over someone, stealing their ideas, things like that, okay? So their integrity is another part of how we evaluate if we can trust them, okay? And then, we've got their character, we've got their integrity, and then we've got something called benevolence. And it is very much what it sounds like. It's whether or not that we think that they have our best interest at heart. If we think that they are supporting us just so that they can steal our ideas and make themselves look better, can't think of any boss who's ever done that, right? Same in a team scenario. If we have kind of a question of benevolence or intention, that's also going to violate trust, okay? So coming into a relationship, we have our disposition-based trust, okay? That's what we start with. And then we have our cognition-based trust, which is based on kind of an assessment. Do we think that we can trust this person? And it's usually based on time with them. It's based on observation. It's based on what people tell us about the person, okay? So these things are building, right? We're deciding how much we're going to trust someone. And at the highest level of trust, we have something called affect-based trust, which is very emotionally driven. I always usually show a picture of Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings, right? They just implicitly trust each other, okay? Not to say that that's how your experience should be with your boss, hopefully not. But the idea is that at a certain point in a relationship, and this could transfer to your personal relationships as well, after a certain amount of time, we will implicitly trust someone that we work with. We have an emotional connection with them. We simply trust them. We're willing to be vulnerable with them. We're willing to take risks in the workplace, and we believe in them. This is sort of the highest level of trust that we can achieve. And it's pretty rare, honestly, in the workplace. And if you think about it, I mean, how often, unless you've worked with someone for a very long time and you've built that kind of friendship and relationship, it's pretty hard to get there. I always say it's a red flag if you're there very quickly after meeting someone. So I kind of call this the middle school dating, if you kind of end up in but daddy, I love him after like a week, that's too soon, right? You haven't built up cognitive trust. You haven't gone through any of these experiences that you need to have to actually trust someone. So affect-based trust is at the end, okay? So we come in to a relationship with our disposition-based trust. Over time, we develop kind of an assessment of how much we trust each other. And eventually, if we're lucky, we get to this emotional affect-based trust, okay? Now, the thing about that is for most of us, we inherit relationships that people have had coming into a team, or the relationships change. So suddenly you're in a leadership position where before you weren't, right? And so as people enter these different roles in the team, they have to figure out how to establish trust, okay? And for some teams and some businesses, you can't get anywhere until you've established trust. So for example, if you're trying to negotiate with someone in Japan, you're not going to get anywhere in that culture unless they've decided that they trust you. And once they trust you, then lots of doors open. United States actually has a relatively high level base of trust, and so we kind of get into these relationships somewhat quickly. But I think it's something to think about as you're entering a relationship, as you're entering a work relationship, not any other kind of relationship in this presentation, but as you're entering a work relationship, as you're entering these teams, as you're trying to navigate how much you trust each other, how you're going to work together, you have to actually get enough data to make an idea or help people understand how to evaluate you as a leader or as a team member, right? Because if you're just coming in, they're going to have their disposition-based trust. They're going to have whatever they've experienced in the past, okay? Same with it, if you've been in a team and there was no trust and suddenly you're trying to trust each other, that's maybe the hardest situation you could be in. It's best to sort of start fresh. Trust is something to proactively manage, okay? It's something to establish and then manage it, because once you break it, you have a big problem. And sort of that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here. And motivation theory says, hey, if suddenly you stop trusting each other, we're going to have a huge motivation drop, okay? And something called expectancy theory is kind of how we understand this. And expectancy theory says basically our effort, we have to believe that a certain amount of our effort is going to lead to a certain level of performance. So we need to believe in our own ability, our own self-efficacy about completing a task as a team or as an individual. We need to see that link between ourselves and the performance, okay? And if we don't see that, then our supervisor, we have to break down the task. We have to build your self-efficacy and your confidence. We have to make sure you understand through these achievement of smaller goals that you can, in fact, do it, okay? But the second part of expectancy theory is all about trust, okay? And it's motivation theory, remember, but there's trust inside of that. So the second step in expectancy theory is this link between your performance and your expected outcomes. So you have to believe that whatever your agreed performance is actually going to lead to the promised outcome. If people don't believe that, they have something called low instrumentality. And all of that means is that they don't trust you. They don't trust that if they do their part, it's going to actually result in the outcome that has been promised. So in the case of a workplace setting, that might be the raise that's been promised 40 times and they've reneged every time at the very end. It's working really hard, performing, and knowing that your team is not going to incorporate your ideas after you've actually produced them, right? It's that failure to believe that the people around you are going to reward you in the way that you expect them to, okay? So if that's broken, okay, if we don't believe whoever holds the outcomes that they're going to reward us, our trust is gone, right? And our motivation is gone. Why would we work hard if we don't think it's going to actually lend us any kind of benefit at the end, okay? The last part of expectancy theory is, do we value the outcomes at all, okay? But right in the middle there is, I need to trust the person who holds the outcomes I care about. And I need to trust if I do what they tell me to do, that I get those outcomes. Now, here's the trick. If you inherit or step into a team where that instrumentality has been broken, saying, okay, if you get to this performance level, that's going to be fantastic and we're going to reward you. And instead, the team got a, that's great, but do better again, right? So, so that's a really common one, right? We did everything you asked and you're still not satisfied, right? You're not happy. You're not rewarding us the way that you promised. So what your job is, usually in a supervisor role, is to try to break down, again, smaller tasks promised if you do this, you will get this. This will happen, right? If we get to X many, whatever it is we're trying to do, we are going to have a pizza party, okay? It doesn't have to be thousands of dollars thrown at you. It can be simple, whatever the reward is. If you do this, then this will happen, right? And so as a leader, as a team member, you have to show over and over that you're reliable. So when you say you do your part and I'm going to do my part and we're going to put it together and it's going to actually be complete, right? They need to trust you that what you're bringing to the table is actually going to work, okay? And they're actually going to not be let down. So you have to do this over time. Again, this is so much easier to manage proactively. So when you're a leader trying to be transparent about what's going on, okay, so if you do X, you will get Y, and this is what you're going to get, right? And letting people see this process is huge, because then this kind of mysterious, I didn't get what I was expected, I'm not very happy, I don't trust you anymore, you said I was going to get this. So trying to be as clear as you can from the beginning, okay? Trying to make sure that your actions are predictable in a way that when somebody expects you to behave in a certain way, you do behave with integrity, you do behave with character, and you are competent. And to let them see that, okay, see your competence over time. See that when you say you're going to do something, you mean it. See that that you do have their best intentions at heart when you have a chance to give them credit, that you do. When you have a chance to behave, within a moral code, making sure that they understand what you value and that you embody and you enact those values. That's crucial, okay? Very hard to do, but so important. And interestingly enough, trust impacts performance, but what it really impacts is commitment. And so people who trust their leaders, who believe in their leaders, who believe in their teammates and trust their teammates, are more likely to voice their ideas. They're more likely to actually free up some of that energy that would be used to defend themselves from someone they don't trust, to take that energy and put it into their work, okay? They're more likely to stay engaged versus withdraw. And by withdraw, I mean you do the bare minimum, okay? You're there, you're a body, you're breathing, and in that case, you're very withdrawn mentally, psychologically. You're just getting your paycheck. And a lot of people sit like that in their jobs, right? But it turns out when we trust and we respect the people around us, the more engaged we are and the less likely we are to do that. So there's kind of these two parts of making sure you establish it from the get-go, and then when you have to repair it, trying to kind of show over and over again your predictability to increase that level of cognitive-based trust. And maybe eventually you'll get people with affect-based trust with you, which is fantastic. But I mean, I would say aim for cognitive, right? And if you get affective, that's fantastic. But aim for cognitive, right? If you can have a high level of perceived trustworthiness in your team, that's fantastic, right? You're going to be able to share your ideas without feeling like you need to protect yourself. You're going to be able to work harder, focus, okay? All right, so that's trust, right? Justice is related, organizational justice. This is one of my favorite topics. I do a ton of research in this, really passionate about it. And the thing about justice perceptions and organizational justice is that they're just that. They're perceptions. There's events, justice events that happen throughout the workday. But when you get down to it, it's how you perceive the event, right? Both cognitively, mentally, so what meaning you take away from what you experienced, and emotionally. So kind of if it made you very upset, if it made you sad, if it made you angry and want revenge, right? And these things are different reactions that people can have to a sense of perceived injustice. Now, in a team setting, and again, when we talk about motivation, when people feel like the system is rigged, our motivation drops, okay? And what I mean by that is that there's different types of fairness perceptions in the workplace. We have what we call distributive justice, which has to do with, do I feel like the outcomes I'm receiving, do I feel like those are fairly given to me for the amount of work I put in, right? Am I getting what I deserve? Now, that's a big question, right? So, and some people feel like, you know, depending, and this is again when you need to be really clear about if you do X, you will get Y, right? Because if people don't understand the reward system, if they don't understand that, they're potentially going to feel like they're having unjust treatment, that you're going to have to then manage their reaction to that. Okay, so distributive justice is all about the sense of inequity between what I put in and what I get out of it. And the interesting thing about justice is that you're comparing yourself, right? We have something where we're looking to the other person bias and we're saying, gosh, Sally doesn't work very hard at all, and she gets all the best shifts, she gets all the best rewards. What is this, right? And when we have a sense of inequity like that, distributive inequity about our outcomes, I'm not getting what I deserve, we tend to actually feel like, hey, I'm going to either work less because you're not going to give me anything for it, so why would I try? So one thing I could do is shrink my input, or I could take more. And that may or may not be legally taking more. So I could choose to, I could choose to steal, I could choose to embezzle. Now these are very extreme examples of restoring equity for employees. But in your mind, when you feel like you're being done wrong and you're not getting what you deserve, you kind of have a couple choices. And one is to either kind of withdraw your inputs, right? Or to try to increase your outputs. And now, the bad way of doing that would be to embezzle, but a positive way could be going to your boss and saying, hey, you know what, based on what I'm actually doing, it doesn't really match what I'm being compensated for. I think I'm actually in this type of position based on HR. My role described as this, I'm actually doing this. I think I'm actually not being compensated fairly. Okay. When you're in a budget crisis, this gets a lot harder to negotiate. But that's a proactive, very adaptive way of dealing with an inequity, a distributive inequity. Now, what happens if I think I'm getting more than I put in? So I'm getting more outcomes for the amount of work I'm doing. So I'm Sally, okay? So I'm getting paid more, I'm getting better shifts, and I don't put in that much work, okay? People, shockingly, are not as bothered by that. So turns out we're really reactive to an inequity where we are losing. We're not as sensitive to an inequity when we're winning. General thing. kind of unfortunate. Now, what you might find is that people will self-justify and they'll say, actually I do work super duper hard. Yeah, I deserve this. Or you're going to have people doing kind of the opposite, where they're feeling bad and they're like, oh gosh, I really am not working enough. I need to actually step up my game. And they actually do work harder. Okay, so that's distributive justice in a team. It can wreck motivation, or if it's done and managed and it's very transparent, it can increase a sense of kind of expectancy and understanding about rewards and fairness. And when we see fairness, we're more likely to feel engaged and work hard, right? So other types of justice that you might see are procedural justice. And procedural justice has to do with the process. So it's not how many outcomes I get or what outcomes I get. It's how it was decided about what I got. Okay? That's very different. So if you think about promotions, if you think about how that's decided, is it based on performance or is it based on who's the favorite? Okay? If I think the process, the hiring process is biased, if I think that the reward process is biased, whatever it is that's deciding what outcomes I get, and those outcomes could be all kinds of things, right? But and usually in the workplace, it has to do with what you're getting paid, and it has to do with promotions and things like that. So if I see that as being unfair, that's called a procedural justice violation. Okay, I see the process as being unfair. What's really interesting is that even when we get a disappointing distributive justice reaction, so I don't feel like I'm getting what I deserve necessarily, but I believe the process for deciding it is relatively fair. Like, I'm disappointed, but I can see why this was the case, and I understand it's transparent. I can see, every step was followed, everyone was treated equally. I'm more okay with it. So this is sort of an understanding of justice as, when you can't control one aspect of organizational justice, you can probably control some of the others. And what we know from research, actually buffer the negative effects of a perceived or felt injustice. When we have other types of justice that let us know, well, maybe this wasn't great, I got a pay cut, but here's why, and I feel like it was done fairly. Okay. The last two types of justice are the most recent, okay? And they have to do with interpersonal justice, which is how you're treated, okay? Are you treated with respect and dignity when you're communicated with? Do people call you names for all the cat sweaters you wear? Do people make fun of you? Do people immediately discount your ideas no matter what it is, even if it's a great idea? They're immediately like, oh, Erica's talking again. All right, do they do that? Informational justice is different. Informational justice has to do with how things are explained to you. Okay, so we talked about procedural justice, which is the process, but informational justice is explaining the why. Why was this decision made? How was it made? All right, was it communicated to you? And that's different, right? Because we can have a fair process, but if nobody knows about it, nobody understands it, nobody knows why any of this was happening, right? Then it feels like an injustice. Okay, this happens when we have teams that are split across locations, okay? Or we have groups that don't communicate well, and we get a decision that is brought down from above, and we're like, why the heck was this decision made? There's no context given, it's just done, okay? That often feels like an informational justice violation. Now, the cool thing about informational justice and interpersonal justice is that they, again, can buffer the negative effects of the other two. So say you have a pay cut, okay? And it's really disappointing. You're not happy with it, but I stop and I give you a very sincere, long explanation about why the decision was made, how it was implemented, and I treat you with respect and dignity when I do it. Turns out that has a massive effect, and there's research that shows things like employee theft, employee retaliation, all that stuff goes down when we simply treat people with respect and dignity, when we explain decisions and we explain the process. This shouldn't seem shocking, but apparently it is. Apparently we need to teach it, because a lot of leaders, a lot of supervisors, a lot of team members don't follow it. And I think it's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just an assumption. We know why the decision was made. Do we need to communicate it? And we kind of forget that when we don't communicate things, or we communicate them very briefly or without kind of a rich explanation, people have different ways of interpreting what they see and how they experience it, right? And turns out with justice, one of the coolest things, depressing cool things about justice is that when we observe an injustice, so we observe someone in our team being treated unfairly, that impacts us too. Research shows that we are impacted by simply observing injustice around us, okay? So if you're in a leadership position, what does this mean, right? Say, right, on top of everything else you have to do, I need to manage all my employees' perceptions, how much they trust me, what do they see, do they think I'm competent, do they think I'm benevolent, do I think I have good character, do I have integrity? I have to demonstrate that over time. I have to be consistent. And on top of that, I need to explain the reward system. And I need to explain why decisions are made the way they are. I need to explain why people get the outcomes they do. And I need to make that transparent, because if people don't understand it, their motivation is going to be low. They're not going to understand how decisions are made. And if they see repeated justice violations, they're going to withdraw, right? They're going to protect themselves. They're going to not voice their opinions. They're going to suddenly stop working in the way that you really need them to work, right? So when we see justice violations, we see trust violations, that really breaks down a team. And so your job in this leadership position is to protect that, okay? So that's making sure that not only your interactions are fair, unbiased, and everyone's got bias. I think by bias, I mean check and make sure that you're listening to people, you're explaining why things are done the way they are, you're giving them credit for their ideas, you're explaining why something can't happen if they have something that they want done and you can't do it. So it's making sure, keeping those communication channels open, hearing your employees, but also responding in a way that they're not left wondering why things are happening the way they're happening. And it's a lot of work. It's work to manage these perceptions. But if you do it over time, you're going to see a massive change in motivation. You're going to see a massive change in commitment and engagement and trust, right? And these things take time. I think that's the hardest things about these two topics, is that they take time and they take energy. And once they're broken, people have a wall up, right? And trying to break that down is really hard. And if you're in a position suddenly where you were their peer and now you're the supervisor, that's really hard too, because you need to establish that you can be trusted in this new role, right? And you have to show time and time again that you demonstrate these principles of trust, these principles of organizational justice, and that they can see that in your actions. And so that's the big challenge. I hope this has helped you some today. And again, justice and trust are completely attainable. They're not easy, but they're attainable. And talk about work-life balance and work-life commitment. These are things that we want to protect. So thank you, and I will talk to you again soon.